next set of speakers will go for until noon when we break for lunch. And we're very pleased to have one of the founding members of the Coalition of Political Assassinations, longtime supporter of our work and one of the organizers of the recent Warren Legacy Commission report here, and an ophthalmologist that has been helping everybody see, including things about the Kennedy assassination. In fact, loaned me some reading glasses at one of my lectures out in Berkeley, which allowed me to read some George Orwell that I couldn't make out in the dark. But Dr. Gary Aguilar, and he's going to speak on, are you doing medical evidence today or Holland?
Combination thing.
Okay, so some of his latest findings, and then we're going to have Rex Bradford, who's done yeoman's work on the documents and the records, and has some information about what sort of an overview of what's new about the case and things that the records reveal. So this is Dr. Aguilar.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody. It'll take me a couple minutes to see if I can get this figured out. First things first, so that we don't run out of power, I probably ought to put an electric cord here.
John, would it be all right if we ask people to come up here so they can for the questions, so we have a better document, better recording?
Yeah, that's good. Fair enough.
I guess we can do it that way, yeah. People are amenable. This is what plugs it to the projector. I don't know where it goes, but and let me make sure.
All right, we're going to try to get the projector. We want to see if we can figure out how to get this projector functioning. We'll, is that on? Okay. And we'll try it again.
Okay. And I'll get the lights for you here.
All right.
Plug in. It should be connected to the source now.
I am,
Yeah, it is on.
here we go.
Okay.
All right, it worked.
Oh, get the lights.
Amazing enough, okay. Let me get back to the beginning of my talk. I don't know how I got so far advanced on this.
That's the better size. The other is too large for the screen.
Okay. Is there any way of coning that down? Thank you all very much for coming today. Let me get the images onto the appropriate. Well, there's no way of coning that down, making it a little bit smaller. Some of the images are going to project right through my head here. I'd be happy to move myself aside.
It's off at the top as well.
It's all at the top as well.
Are you able to keep it on the other framing that you have the recorder?
I probably could keep it on the other framing. Like that?
That's better.
Okay, all right. If you don't mind...
Here, if you maximize it, I can zoom in.
Okay, we can figure this out. Yeah. Zoom in and maybe move it up a little bit toward the top. Let me just start here while we're working on this to give you an idea of where I'd like to discuss this today. Some of you who were in Washington for the conference in September may know or will know that a professor of neurosurgery from the University of California at San Diego named Michael Levy, a very reasonable chap, came to give what was, I thought, a quite effective PowerPoint presentation on the medical evidence. Neurosurgery, a peer-reviewed medical scientific journal, has written now 2 of what they propose will ultimately be 3 articles on the Kennedy assassination. The driving force behind the articles are the recollections of a neurosurgeon who was present in Dallas in Trauma Room 1, apparently, Robert Grossman. Robert Grossman is now chairman of the Department of Neurosurgery at Baylor in Houston, and he was not known at the time of the assassination in terms of the early records to have been involved at all. He was named as present by only one of the witnesses being a Parkland doctor named Ken Salyer, who was clearly identified as having been part of the resuscitation team. Dr. Grossman was the then new junior professor of neurosurgery at Dallas, Texas Southwestern Medical Center, and he came in with Kemp Clark, who was the chairman of the Department of Neurosurgery, the most senior examining doctor to examine Jack Kennedy's wounds. And in the aftermath of the assassination, many of the doctors left records, not only contemporaneous notes that they wrote that day, which became Warren Commission documents. They were also called to testify before the Warren Commission. They made appearances occasionally even at press conferences and so on and so forth. Robert Grossman left no imprint at that time about his recollections. His first comments appeared in 1981 in an interview by the Boston Globe. And at that time, there was a great deal of controversy about the wounds being so different as described by the Parkland doctors as compared with the autopsy photographs that were then the subject of some controversy in the aftermath of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. For people who know nothing at all about these controversies, I'll try to outline it fairly simply and to say that at Parkland Hospital, the doctors that tried to resuscitate Jack Kennedy noted that he had a large wound that involved the right rear portion of his head. The back of the head, there is a bone called the occipital bone, and so it's often referred to as occipital. And most of the contemporaneous accounts written on the day of the assassination, both by the professor of neurosurgery, Kemp Clark, whose records, of course, we do have, and others who were there, described a large occipital or parietal occipital. The parietal bone extends from the very back of the head going forward along the side, and of course you have the frontal bone here. The temporal bone is over your temporal. So the simple anatomic lesson is that the frontal part of the skull was not noted then to have been damaged by the witnesses at Parkland. The posterior parietal and occipital bones, which are at the very back portion of the head, were described as being damaged. In any case, this caused some considerable controversy, and Ben Bradley for the Boston Globe wrote an article in which he interviewed a number of the Parkland doctors, got high-quality reproductions of images of the autopsy photographs, and wrote that there were clear conflicts here. Robert Grossman then, for the first time, described having seen a small wound in the back of the head, about an inch in diameter, in the occiput, and a wound on the side of the head. His description was virtually unique among the other Parkland doctors. He was a neurosurgeon at the time, of course, when he made the observations, and was still, of course, by then head of a department. And so his recollections were of some significance. In any case, neurosurgery then decided, in the aftermath of articles, I think, that were published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, that led to the Journal of the American Medical Association being successfully sued by a Parkland doctor here, Charles Crenshaw, now deceased. They paid Charles Crenshaw $250,000 judgment in the aftermath of his filing suit for defamation. And those articles have attracted what we call virtually no secondary literature. They were poorly written, poorly researched, and were not in any way an addition to what we understand about the medical evidence. So the medical literature has been very quiet on JFK's autopsy evidence until now these 3 articles have come out. The first one I won't dwell upon other than to show you just summarily what Dr. Grossman, who is featured, and his recollections are featured in the first article, describes as Jack Kennedy's wounds. The second article, which is the one that I would like to discuss today and put it in some kind of context, is one that was written by Dr. Michael Levy, who came and spoke in Washington, and at a dinner afterward admitted he really had no primary source of information on this, was somewhat sketchy about how he had acquired the information that filled up a 20-page article on the subject, and the article was an article that basically summarized JFK's medical and autopsy evidence. Now, by way of discussing JFK's medical autopsy evidence, what I want to do today is discuss it in the context of how neurosurgery explored it, because I think that one of the things that has come out that Rex Bradford is going to be discussing in more detail is what we've learned from the Assassination Records Review Board, and we've learned a hell of a lot. Neurosurgery, ironically, paints a picture of JFK's medical autopsy evidence status post ante the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Their recounting of evidence is extremely obsolete and inaccurate, quite frankly. In any case, this is looking at it from their standpoint. Here is a cover sheet from the article, Neuroforensic Analysis of the Wounds of President John F. Kennedy, Part 2. Here we are. This shows the article, and as you can see, slide right, Michael Levy is the lead author, a very pleasant chap who, my hat's off to him. He flew back to give us his talk and did a very nice job of the PowerPoint presentation in Washington, D.C. He flew back on a red-eye. When I was an idle and dissolute youth, I spent time in neurosurgery and had actually toyed with the idea of doing neurosurgery when I was doing a residency in general surgery. I did internal medicine for a year and then did general surgery for a year before going into ophthalmology. And neurosurgeons are crazy, and their line of work is a crazy line of work. So I suppose for a neurosurgeon to be up all night is pretty much standard operating procedure, but it was very generous of him to give us that time. The other authors here is Daniel Sullivan, who is the lead author on the first article. He has a master's in divinity and is associated, I think, dealing with ethical issues in neurosurgery at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. Roderick Fascio, which I did not realize at the time when I saw this, turns out to be one of the editors of the journal Neurosurgery that this appeared in, and of course Robert Grossman. Robert Grossman clearly is the driving force behind these articles. In any case, Dr. Levy/Grossman defend the lone gunman hypothesis, and that's the real thrust of Part 2. It appears in a peer-reviewed journal, and there's a significant irony to this, which I'd like to develop today, and that is that the presentation that they made was in the aftermath of both Dr. Grossman having complimented me on an essay I wrote, which is up on Rex Bradford's website, called How 5 Investigations Got It Wrong. He complimented me on that prior to this paper appearing in print. And in that very paper, I am drawing from, in today's presentation and in the presentation I made before, I'm drawing, in that very paper that was written before he published his article, I debunk all of the issues that they use as evidence to support the lone gunman hypothesis. In addition, last year there was a conference in Pittsburgh. Those of you that were there will know there were 1,300 people in the audience, and Robert Grossman was there as well. Sat in the audience and heard me again go through this evidence, and in the course of that, not knowing what they were going to publish in Neurosurgery later, I discussed all the issues and debunked much of the evidence that ended up being what we call primary, secondary sources of information that Neurosurgery and Michael Levy used to defend the lone gunman hypothesis. But the state of the case today from the medical standpoint, I think, is embarrassing for me as a physician, that men who know better, who knew who to ask about this evidence, who knew who to get as a peer reviewer, i.e. me, didn't think to do so. And I say that not out of just personal boastfulness or pique. It's just that for those of you that have seen How 5 Investigations Got It Wrong up on the web, you don't have to take my word for a testimony, because it's hot linked to source documents online. HSCA testimony, Rockefeller Commission stuff, AARB releases, all that sort of stuff is available online. You can read it, you can check it for yourself. In any case, they knew this before they wrote this article and nevertheless put it out anyhow, and it's embarrassing to me. I don't think that they would have done it in any other neurosurgical topic, but they did it in the JFK. In any case, They argue for the lone gunman hypothesis, basing their defense on both primary sources of information, as you can see, top left, and secondary sources of information. Most importantly, they dwell on the issue of the accounts of Parkland witnesses. The second thing, of course, is for primary sources is autopsy report, an examination of JFK's clothing, ballistics data, and the Warren report. The secondary source of information that involved certain additional ballistics tests, which we're going to go into. The Clark panel review, a group of acknowledged experts that looked at the evidence in 1968. Dr. Latimer's review that occurred in the late 70s. Dr. Weck's review, the House Select Committee on Assassinations report, and the AARB's report. Now, ironically, even though they mention the AARB and its report, they incorporate none of the findings in the AARB, as I'll develop. In any case, let's start with the primary sources, and these are the Parkland witnesses. Nothing was more central to JFK's injuries than his skull injuries. So as we can see, these are taken from original documents either written on the day of the assassination or in testimony given before the Warren Commission. This is not something that I collected later on. I do have all their testimonies, everything they've said about the wounds, but these are their original earliest statements. And as you can see, Dr. Perry, Malcolm Perry, who performed the tracheostomy on Jack Kennedy and had a very good chance to observe Jack Kennedy's wounds, described his skull wound as an occipital parietal, again, right posterior portion of the skull. Dr. Carrico, someone else who was involved in the resuscitation effort, said posterior skull in the occipital region. Marion Thomas Jenkins was the anesthesiologist. Anesthesiologists, for those of you who aren't physicians in the audience, sit at a patient when they're undergoing resuscitation with their head essentially between their legs. They're sitting right there at the head of the table, and they're right there. They have a superb access to view the skull wounds because they're sitting, whereas other people may be standing in the room, and so they're almost at eye level with the victim, in this case's skull injuries. And then Dr. Baxter, who described it as temporal and occipital bones being missing, and Paul Peters, another doctor. Here is a diagram, top right, the leftmost diagram was a pictorial representation that was prepared under the direction of Robert McClellan, and it first was published in the book 6 Seconds in Dallas in 1967 by Tink Thompson, who many of you know. Here are some images on the right. One is Charles Crenshaw, and then another one is Ronald Jones, both Parkland doctors who were there. The Journal of the American Medical Association, for example, slammed Charles Crenshaw because he dared to suggest the wounds might not have been consistent with a single gunman, and Charles Crenshaw was documented as having been there by 6 different people in Warren Commission testimony. Dr. Delaney was another doctor who was there at the time of the autopsy, and Nurse Audrey Bell. They all had their hands in about the same place, indicating that that's where the skull wound was that they saw. Here are more images. You can see Ed Hoffman, Mrs. Willis. There's Robert McClelland, a Parkland doctor. Paul Peters again. Ken Salyer, the only doctor who identified Dr. Grossman as having been anywhere near the resuscitation room, and he does not place him in the room. He just says he saw him going just outside the room, and with the possibility exists, of course, that he was there, and he probably was there. Here is a letter that Dr. Paul Peters wrote Harry Livingston when Harry Livingston had sent them the image, which is McClelland's diagram. Now, he had sent them the image saying, Dr. McClelland said that here where this diagram from 6 Seconds in Dallas is where Dr. McClelland says he saw a wound. Paul Peters then wrote back to him with this X pointing, yes, that's where it is, essentially. You'll find that in High Treason, a copy of that letter on Paul Peters' stationery from Texas Southwestern Medical Center. In any case, I assembled these witness statements, and it's very clear that the wound Kennedy sustained involved the right rear of his head most prominently, in all likelihood, but it did not confine itself to that area. It also involved the right side of the skull as well. It was a rather massive wound. And when you put together the earliest recollections of the statements from the first physician I list there is Kemp Clark, because he was a professor of neurosurgery. It is his business to understand the nature of skull injuries. He was quite experienced at the time, having been at the head of a place that had a lot of trauma, Parkland, Dallas's Parkland Hospital, was recognized even by us at UCLA's Harvard General Hospital as being one of the places that you go to for really superb training. It was in the league, we used to say. In any case, and you can see how it all lines up here. Virtually all of them said the wound involved the right rear of the head. Some also made note that it was involved the right side, and even some had it going from front of the skull to the back of the skull, Adolf Giesecke. I put an asterisk behind Giesecke's name there, number 13, because he's the only doctor to pick the wrong side of the skull when he gave his recollection. He said it was on the left side of the skull. Everybody else, of course, got it right and said it was on the right side of the skull. In any case, Dr. Grossman, in this article, dismisses all the Parkland doctors, all his colleagues, all the people who wrote down what they saw on the day of the assassination, saying that, well, doctors do use the term occipital somewhat loosely to mean, sort of toward the back a little bit, but not very specifically. And again, I just recount here that Dr. Perry, Carrico, Jenkins, Baxter, and Peters all use the term occipital. And about that, Dr. Grossman said many doctors loosely use the term occipital to refer to the back fifth of the head. And of course, he wanted to distinguish himself from these doctors who use the term loosely, because he's a neurosurgeon, and neurosurgeons specialize in head injuries. They know exactly how to use the terms and are quite punctilious about their use. Again, we have the non-neurosurgeons, but experienced trauma surgeons who, from my own experience as having been a chairman of the Department of Surgery, having been in general surgery and done lots of work in the various specialties, I don't think any of these trauma specialists, nor would I have been when I was doing that kind of work, none of these people tend to be terribly loose with that term. In any case, let's compare the term with what Dr. Kemp Clark, who was then the chairman of the Department of Neurosurgery at Texas Southwest Medical Center, said, and Kemp Clark was Robert Grossman's boss. At the time, much more experienced in wounds than Grossman was. He described it as there was a large wound in the right occipital parietal region. That's what he wrote on the day of the assassination. In testimony for the Warren Commission, he said there was a large wound beginning at the right occiput extending the parietal region. So perhaps Dr. Grossman wants to dismiss all the Parkland doctors because they were loose with the term occipital, which I think is unfair, given that they wrote their recollections immediately and he waited 18 years to write his. But I don't know what he's going to do with Dr. Kemp Clark, and in fact, he doesn't really do much with Kemp Clark. It's interesting that what is apparent to me is that the writers, the authors of neurosurgery, are not familiar with what Dr. Grossman himself had told the Assassination Records Review Board. Apparently, they were a little bit dissatisfied, shall we say, the Assassination Records Review Board was with Dr. Grossman. And there was a quote in there by one of the interviewers who said that repeatedly during the interview, Dr. Grossman suggested that we need to interview Kemp Clark, and said that he felt Dr. Clark's observation would be more accurate than his own, since Dr. Clark had much more experience at that time than he with gunshot wounds to the head and neurosurgery in general, and of course he had been. And of course, Kemp Clark was quite clear that the wound involved the occiput and occipital parietal area. No attention was made or paid to by neurosurgery to the fact that eyewitness testimony is notoriously inaccurate when one has seen an event and not recalled it or written it down or left any record of what that recollection is until 18 years later, which is the case with Dr. Grossman. You have Gerald Posner even weighing in on the fact that testimony given closer to an event is liable to be more accurate. And of course, the reigning authority on eyewitness testimony, Elizabeth Loftus, whose book Eyewitness Testimony has been republished by Harvard University Press, I think 5 or 6 times now, the most recent edition being, I think, 3 or 4 years old. That is not from where I take this particular quote, but she is one who has made it very clear what the factors are that degrade memory, and of course, principal among them is a long duration between the event and the time when the event was recalled. In any case, so we have to decide whether we should take Dr. Grossman's advice to not listen to any of the Parkland doctors, including the doctor who he says presumably, the doctor who he had said had a better vantage point and was more experienced, Dr. Kemp Clark. None of this gets short-shrifted in neurosurgery. They really muff it, and they don't explain why it is we should take the opinion of a man over all these other experts, including his own boss. In any case, we'll go on to another source of primary source of information used by Dr. Levy and Grossman is the autopsy report. The autopsy report describes JFK's skull wound as being a large irregular defect, and this is direct quote, large irregular defect of the scalp and skull, parietal, temporal, and occipital areas measuring 13 centimeters in its largest diameter. And this is the diagram, the Rydberg diagram that was prepared, showing a wound that pretty much conforms more or less with what you might get from the written description. And you see the bullet coming in low where it says in, low in the back of the skull, in the area near the external occipital protuberance, low in the back of the skull, and coming out toward the side, right side. But while he calls the autopsy report a primary source of information, neurosurgery and Dr. Levy and Grossman say nothing about another primary source of information, which are notes taken on the night of the autopsy. Now, notes taken during a procedure, during any kind of a laboratory examination, bench notes as it were, original handwritten autopsy notes, are perhaps the most important piece of evidence there is and clearly merit being considered as primary information. The reason that these are so important in this particular case is that whereas the autopsy report says that the wound is 13 centimeters in greatest diameter, on the night of the autopsy, you can see this diagram here, and right in the middle you see the word 17, or the number 17, and the word missing underneath it. Dr. Boswell, who prepared this diagram, was asked, would it be fair to say that when you first examined the body prior to any arrival of fragments from Dallas, the skull was missing from approximately those dimensions of 10 by 17? And Boswell said yes. So it turns out that the skull wound wasn't 13 centimeters. It was much larger than this, at least 4 centimeters larger than this. 17 centimeters is quite a huge defect. And here you can see this, arrows pointing forward to aft. Here is a color version of the diagram taken on the night of the autopsy, and you can see these blood splotches on this diagram. Those are Kennedy's blood splotches. Dr. Humes said that he testified that he destroyed the original autopsy notes because they had the presence of blood on them, and of course the ones that he didn't destroy also happened to have the blood on them. I'll discuss that later on. In any case, you can see here that we have a diagram showing 17 centimeters missing, and this is a diagram on the right prepared after Dr. Boswell had marked on a skull of a human skull how large the skull wound was. They then transposed the images on the skull, which I'll show you in a minute, to two-dimensional skull diagrams that I provided them from a standard anatomy text, Grant's Atlas of Anatomy. And you can see how large this defect was. Now, I didn't bring it today, but I've often brought a human skull to show people that if you put a ruler to a skull and you assume that the wound was way at the high portion of the skull, there isn't a 17 centimeters in front of that to go. You have to carry that wound way into the back of the skull for there to be a full 17 centimeters. In any case, here's a diagram based on Boswell's testimony to the Assassination Records Review Board, and here's a skull showing how far in the back of the skull it went. This mark about here, there is the external occipital protuberance, and that area of skull that area of missing skull was quite massive. So here we can contrast them between what was originally part of a perhaps not primary source of information, but a secondary source of information, the diagram showing that skull wound, and the one on the right showing how large it really was. Now, this next evidence they used to argue for the lone gunman has been evidence that has been bandied about for quite a long time and has been discredited even longer. We owe the original debunking of this evidence to Harold Weisberg's book, 1975, in Postmortem on page 600. He debunks this bit of business. In any case, this business that the idea is that Jack Kennedy was shot from behind, and the fibers in the back of his jacket and shirt are bent inward. The fibers in the front of the shirt are bent outward, indicating the direction to travel the bullet. Well, that seems to make a lot of common sense. And in fact, in Kennedy and Lincoln in 1980, John Latimer says that a, quote, analysis of the cloth fibers which had shown traces of copper, which had also revealed that the fibers had been bent inward, indicating that this was a wound of entry according to the FBI laboratory tests. In other words, the FBI laboratory test, John Latimer is telling us, saying that the wound has a wound of entry because the fibers are bent inward. We can go on the Rockefeller Commission expert, Dr. Richard Lindenberg, which does not show up very well, the bottom left slide, but he was one of the experts that the Rockefeller Commission used, also said that in front of JFK's shirt, the bullet produced a 1.2 vertical slits, 1.2 centimeter vertical slits in the overlapping parts of the collar, and the stumps of the torn fibers of the material point to the outside, indicating it had exited there. Kenneth Ron, who runs the modestly titled the academic JFK assassination website, includes among what he calls reliable evidence the fact that the fibers around the hole in the shirt and the jacket were bent forward. So this is evidence that is, even to this day, is touted as reliable evidence, important evidence. And neurosurgery discussed the business of bent fibers 4 times in the article. Here we are. Dr. Levy says these clothing changes were characterized during an initial examination by the FBI laboratory, he says. And he gives this quote. And here's the quote, and you can see on slide left, the hole in the front of the shirt was a ragged slit-like hole, and you can see also in slide right that this quote comes directly from that. Does anybody have a laser pointer? I didn't bring mine. Anyone happens to have one, it'd be helpful. But you can see that in slide left, the hole in the front of the shirt was a ragged slit-like hole, and that is a direct quote, and this is a page taken from the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Now, what he didn't tell you was, because he said that it came from the FBI laboratory, that this quote that the HSCA repeated did not come from an FBI laboratory report. It came from a letter J. Edgar Hoover wrote the Warren Commission. The initial FBI lab report said nothing about the fibers being bent inwards or outwards. And in fact, you can see, because this quote of Levy takes you to a footnote, and that footnote takes you directly to paragraph 255 in volume 7 of the HSCA. And whereas he talks about the FBI laboratory, it makes it very clear that in the correspondence from Hoover to Rankin referred to earlier, Hoover further characterized the defect in the shirt. Now, the next paragraph is even more telling. The HSCA tells you that this idea that the fibers were bent comes from Hoover, and the HSCA then advises you in the very next paragraph, 256, while the FBI's laboratory's initial description did not offer evidence concerning the direction of fibers, the observation in this letter were substantive evidence of the direction of penetration, provided that the position of the threads had not changed in the interim. As stated previously, the panel itself, that is the House Select Committee on Assassinations Forensics Panel, cannot assess evidentiary significance to the fiber direction because of the numerous intervening examinations. All this is left out of the Ken Ron doesn't talk about it, Michael Levy doesn't talk about it in neurosurgery, John Latimer doesn't talk about it, and all this was published since essentially the HSCA had debunked the bent fiber evidence. Now, the bent fiber evidence had, in a way, been somewhat quietly debunked even by the FBI lab expert Robert Frazier. And he was the first one to examine JFK's clothes, and in his Warren Commission testimony, He said that JFK's bent shirt fibers were indicative of exit only, quote, assuming that when I first examined this shirt, it had not been altered from the condition it was in at the time the hole was made. In other words, he was unwilling to commit himself even to the fact that this evidence was very important or useful. And again, we have the HSCA saying very much the same thing. In any case, this original debunking goes back to 1975 on page 600 of Harold Weisberg's book. He points out the fact that nowhere in the FBI's original lab report about JFK's clothing was there any mention about fibers being bent inward and outward. That premiered for the first time in the letter Hoover wrote the commission. And Hoover, I think, has a deserved reputation of having wanted to bend the direction to favor the lone gunman solution. But none of that was made clear. And the interesting thing about the neurosurgery piece, which is very discouraging to me, I sent the pages from, I happen to own a set of both paper and computer copies of the HSCA volumes. I sent the pages right from the HSCA to the editor in neurosurgery, pointing out to them, I said, you know, you quoted one sentence here that makes it sound pretty damning right from the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and then omitted the one where they debunked it, which is the very following sentence. It'll be interesting to see whether neurosurgery ever gets around to correcting that. In any case, next thing to go to, other primary sources of information that they go with are the ballistics data. And again, this is evidence that neurosurgery used or cited in support of the lone gunman hypothesis. And the ballistics data they referred to, and here's a direct quote from the paper, from Dr. Levy's paper, that test bullet blew out the right side of the reconstructed cranium in a manner very similar to the head of the wounds of the president. That's a direct quote from the paper itself. Well, it turns out that that's a verbatim quote from the Warren report, except that where cranium was used by Dr. Levy, the word skull was used by the Warren Commission. In any case, we've seen the diagram that the Warren Commission used to understand JFK's wounds, and that's the Rydberg diagram up there on the left. And here's the test skull. Now, I don't know if it's apparent to you or me that there is a slight difference between the two, but it's very interesting to then read Dr. Olivier's testimony to the Warren Commission. Dr. Olivier was the expert who testified before the Warren Commission about their shooting duplication tests. And in these duplication tests, he said that skull blew out the right side in a manner very similar to the wounds of the president. Now, the one thing that's evident to anyone looking at this image right here is, as Dr. John Latimer even pointed out in his book, Kennedy and Lincoln's, why did the attempts by government ballistics experts to reproduce President Kennedy's head wounds not produce skull wounds more similar to Kennedy's? And sure enough, in the test skulls, the entire right orbit, the upper portion of the cheek, and the right frontal bone was blown out, as was the entire right parietal area and a lot of the occipital area. Jack Kennedy's, here an autopsy photograph, bottom left, I've seen the original, and this is a bona fide original image. It's a second or third generation, but that's what the originals will show you. And the Rydberg diagram, of course, makes the point that the Warren Commission then knew that there was no damage to his orbit, no damage to his frontal bone, to speak of, perhaps a slight damage to the posterior portion of the frontal bone, no damage to his right cheek. They did shooting experiments to duplicate the experiments. The experiments gave quite incompatible results, and yet they called this an adequate duplication of the shooting, and that it proved that the shots fired probably would inflict the wounds that Jack Kennedy sustained. No one in the Warren Commission was impolite enough to suggest, even though they'd already seen the Rydberg diagram, that the skull looked nothing at all like it. And this isn't just a Warren critic who is making sort of an unflattering comment about this. This is even John Latimer noted that these were quite different, but it was not noted then. The next thing to dwell upon, I think that's worth discussing, is how, in terms of a primary source of information and the shooting tests, the House Select Committee on Assassinations decided that Jack Kennedy's head wound was caused by a bullet that did not go in, as indicated in the central image, low in the skull, through near the external occipital protuberance that had gone through the skull much higher. That's what both the Clark panel, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and the Rockefeller Commission, all three of them later decided, and what is the view of a lot of people, that the bullet went in much higher toward the top of the skull and not as low as originally described in the original autopsy report. A couple of things are worth mentioning, that the duplication tests, they did shoot the skulls through that red line there, and they got exactly the kind of results that you would have expected by where that line will carry the bullet forward. A bullet traveling in that trajectory, striking the skull low, will give you the image that you see on slide right, showing the massive loss of the right orbit, right cheekbone, and so on and so forth. The Warren Commission, and I did not dwell upon this, and Dr. Levy in his paper did not dwell upon this, was not above sort of jimming the evidence a little bit to try to make the evidence fit the circumstances. The image on slide left is taken from Tink Thompson's book, where even in 1967 he noticed the fact that the Rydberg diagram was drawn presumably to depict the position of Jack Kennedy's head at the moment he took the shot, showing the bullet coming in and going out. And you'll notice one thing, of course, the bullet, according to the autopsy report, is supposed to have gone in very low in the head, and if it went in low in the head, it would have come out the face. So what they did was tilt Jack Kennedy's head forward in the Rydberg diagram even more than it was, as you can see at the bottom of that slide. His chin was not nearly bent as far as that, but to make the trajectory work, the Warren Commission tilted the head down. Not worth going into in any great detail, but there was some background discussion by Warren Commission members to make certain that the angle of inclination of the head tilt in the Rydberg diagram matched the pictures, and it's very clear it did not. No one bothered to correct the error or to show what the implications would be if the error had been corrected. Okay, yeah, stop for a moment and change tape. I can dwell on this again, but this is quite interesting. If you'll actually hold an image of 312, and the slide at the bottom left here is 312, which is the instant before Jack Kennedy takes it in the head, and you compare that side by side with the Rydberg diagram, you'll see the Rydberg diagram has Jack Kennedy's head tilted about another 15 degrees, chin downward. And see, if the chin is that much further downward, then you can then kind of reconstruct it with the bullet coming in low, coming out toward the top of his head, because his chin is tilting downward, his forehead is then tilting downward further away, and that can allow for the kind of wounds that he was known to have been known to have sustained according to the autopsy report. We're waiting for a little technical glitch here. But the interesting thing about this peer-reviewed paper in the medical scientific literature is that it was a very interesting manner in which the evidence was selected. Evidence that fit was selected, evidence, even very clear evidence in the Assassination Records Review Board, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, others, that did not fit was left on the cutting room floor. It was completely discarded. There's another little irony to this while they're getting the tape up here. In the end, on the last page of the paper, and I actually have it here on my computer if anyone wants to see it or wants a copy of it, the neurosurgery paper, they have letters that were published with the publication of the paper, indicating, of course, that the authors of these letters had seen the paper and presumably had some comments. Well, one of them that wrote favorably about how the paper brings us up to date on the medical autopsy evidence is a guy named Larry Sturdivant, who is known to some of you here in the audience. Larry Sturdivant testified very much in favor of the lone gunman hypothesis, and his testimony is in Volume 1 of the HSCA. The other thing that I didn't realize at the time is that Larry Sturdivant worked with these duplication shooting tests, in which, as we're showing here in these diagrams, these shooting tests were reported on by Laurence Olivier for the Warren Commission, working at Edgewood Arsenal at the time. And Larry Sturdivant worked for Edgewood Arsenal and testified to the fact that he was involved in these, quote, duplication, unquote, shooting tests. So I have wondered and have been reluctant to ask whether Larry Sturtevant is the one that suggested they present this, the experiments that he was involved in producing. Can I go on? Yes. Okay. So we'll pick it up now. So to carry forward into other primary sources of information that were not called primary sources of information, or were not considered as that by neurosurgery, you have Dr. Boswell's face sheet autopsy notes and the notes and descriptions of witnesses who were present at JFK's autopsy. Those are pretty important sources of information. They're certainly primary. Here we have the, as we discussed before, the face sheet from Boswell's notes taken on the night of the autopsy on the left, and this is a much more recent 1996 rendition of how he diagrammed the wounds. Even 35 years later, he was saying pretty much the same thing. So we'll go on to the secondary source of information that neurosurgery uses to bolster the lone gunman hypothesis, and among them are Latimer's ballistics tests, the Clark panel review, Latimer's review, Weck's review, and so on and so forth. Now, I have always found myself questioning Dr. Latimer's objectivity on this subject. And one of the things that brings me to question his objectivity on this is, first of all, he shot both skulls and melons, and as Dr. Sturtevant testified before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, when they'd shot skulls, they shot them lower in the skull than it was later determined by some people that the bullet had entered. They decided the bullet had entered much higher. But Sturtevant did testify to the fact that every skull they shot flew away from the rifle. In other words, they shot it from the behind and it went away. Now, of course, we see in the Zapruder film that Kennedy's hit in the head and he lurches backwards to the rear left. Now, Latimer does shooting experiments with both skulls and melons, and he writes in his book that I wish to re-emphasize that none of our test objects in these shooting experiments with melons and skulls ever jumped or fell off the stand away from the shooter. He'd like you to believe, and I know people who've done shooting tests with melons, Art Snyder, who's at Stanford Linear Accelerator, a senior physicist, Doug DeSales, who's an experienced gunman, a physician in Sacramento. They've done a lot of shooting tests, and I don't know anyone that's gotten that result. In other words, Latimer will tell you that whether he was shooting at melons or skulls, they always came back at him after he hit him with a bullet. Most other people will tell you that particularly with melons, that most of them rocked away, at least initially, or went to one side or another. Sometimes it would rock very gently back toward you, but in no case was there any consistent pattern of them always moving back toward you, which is the results that Latimer reported. I just don't believe that that's true. I don't believe that's happened, nor was that the experience of the people at Aberdeen Proving Ground when they did this for the Warren Commission. All those skulls, as you might very well have expected, flew away from the rifle. In any case, he then said that because the Warren Commission had been ineffective at producing wounds that had duplicated Jack Kennedy's injuries, he adjusted the firing so that he would shoot the skull slightly higher, and then he presented this image, which is taken from his book, saying that this image did much more accurately duplicate Jack Kennedy's skull wounds. And you can see that what is principally missing here is the frontal bone. Let's compare the image that you see there with the autopsy report's description of what was actually missing at the time, and it was parietal, temporal, and occipital. No mention in the autopsy report that the frontal bone was missing. This is John Latimer's duplication. All right, so we'll go on to the Clark panel review, and this is particularly interesting to me, as those of you who may have heard me speak before or read parts of my essay, my 9-part essay on how 5 investigations got it wrong. The Clark panel, and I don't show it here, I've discussed it before and it's up online. one of the things that one of the HSCA researchers pointed out to is the fact that when people don't want to find evidence, they won't find it. And when they have their mind made up, they generally tend to follow along the lines they have their minds made up on when they embark on a project. In a letter, one of the Clark panelists, Russell Fisher, I'm sorry, not in a letter, but in an article he wrote in a scientific journal, he describes the fact that he got a call from the Attorney General of the United States asking him would he rally around and do some research for them on Kennedy's autopsy materials. And he was told by Ramsey Clark that Ramsey Clark was very concerned from what he had read in some of the galleys for Tink Thompson's book, 6 Seconds in Dallas. And he wanted some independent people to review the autopsy evidence to you know, dispel some of these myths being put forward by Warren's skeptics. Well, Russell Fisher clearly had an idea of what he was being asked to do, and that is essentially endorse the conclusions of the Warren Commission. And so they went about their work and they produced a report. And one of the reasons that makes you suspect that they were not very cautious about their work, had basically determined at the outset what the conclusions were going to be, was because of the, one can determine that they'd worked that way because they were enormously sloppy in their work. We're not talking about, you know, subtle errors. We're talking about the kind of errors that residents wouldn't make, at least none of the residents that I've taught or worked with, and certainly not experienced professional heads of departments. The Clark panel asserted, for example, on number 1, top left, that both of JFK's lateral skull x-rays were left lateral. Well, in fact, they aren't. One's left lateral, one's right lateral. You don't have to be a chairman of the Department of Radiology to realize that. The Clark panel also asserted that on lateral x-ray number 2, that there was a fragment trail. And this fragment formation's long axis, if extended posteriorly, passes through the above-mentioned hold 1 centimeter above the visible metal fragment. I'll discuss that in a minute. In other words, they're saying there's a nice fragment trail going across the top of the skull, showing that that's right where the bullet passed. And it goes right to where they said that fragment trail goes right to where they said the bullet entered, 10 centimeters above the original placement for it. We'll be discussing that in a minute. It turns out the fragment trail is even higher than that, significantly higher than that, according to the Clark panelists later on. According to my own view, the Clark panelists, I'm sorry, not the Clark panelists, but House Select Committee on Assassinations, they said there were no bullet fragments on the left side of the Jack Kennedy skull x-rays or on the lower portion of Jack Kennedy's skull x-rays. Well, there are some. Just to the right of the cervical spine, number 4, there were several small metallic fragments present on in this region of the x-ray. Those aren't metal fragments. They're artifacts. All the subsequent radiologists that have looked at this are all in agreement on the fact that these 4 things are entirely wrong. They weren't that careful about their work, the Clark panel wasn't. Let's go through that assertion number 2, because I think this is the most telling. The original Warren report and the original autopsy report has a fragment trail going from the bottom of the skull, right here, forward. Well, even on this not very good quality image, you can tell there's no fragment trail down that low. But that's written in the autopsy report as saying that the x-rays revealed a fragment trail going from the low entrance point near the external occipital protuberance, which is this area here, forward toward the top of the skull, or toward the front portion of the skull. Well, the Clark panel decided that the bullet had entered where that short arrow is, right in that little divot there, and it says that on lateral x-ray number 2, this fragment trail on long axis, if extended posteriorly, passes through the above-mentioned hole 1 centimeters above the visible metal fragment. Now, I wish I could demonstrate that visible metal fragment to you all to show you where it is, but you won't be able to see it in the x-rays, and it's even hard to see in the originals. The visible metal fragment is about there. And you see right above that there's a crack in the bone, and they would have you believe that they reported, the Clark panel did, that there's a fragment trail going right from there forward. Well, that's not where the fragment trail is. Even on this enhanced image that was published by the HSCA, you can see where the fragment trail is, and it's about 5 centimeters above that. But they had their conclusions. They knew what they wanted to say. They knew what they wanted the evidence to show, and so they just reported it out as if it did show that. Another assertion, the autopsy photos show a well-defined zone of discoloration at the back wound, most pronounced on its upper and outer margin. Now, some of you are familiar with the concept of abrasion collar, but for the majority of you who may not be, when a bullet hits perfectly perpendicularly, it leaves a little bruise that's perfectly circular. When it comes from above and strikes hitting downward, it stretches the skin at the upper edge of the wound first and leaves a larger abrasion collar above. If it strikes from below, it leaves a larger abrasion collar from below. And that's how you can sometimes tell the direction a bullet hit from, by where the abrasion collar is, because it will be asymmetric if it has not hit perfectly perpendicularly. So the Clark panel tells us that there was a well-defined zone of discoloration at the edge of the back wound, most pronounced in its upper and outer margins. Good solid proof. The bullet was coming down at him because the abrasion collar is at the upper edge of the wound. Well, you don't need to be unfortunately, it does not project to the back, and I'm standing in front of it right here anyhow, but those of you can see it. Here's a much larger abrasion collar below than above. This is an image from the autopsy photographs, and it's even clearer in the originals that the abrasion collar is, and it's not just my saying so. All the other experts who have subsequently looked at this, subsequent to the Clark panel, said the abrasion collar was more prominent in the lower part of his wound. The Rockefeller commissioners and the House Select Committee on Assassinations forensics experts all said the abrasion collar was low at the lower portion of the wound. And they explained it by saying that Kennedy was bent forward at the time he was shot in the back, and therefore the bullet traveled up through him. But again, the important thing is the Clark panelists had decided what they wanted the evidence to show. They wanted the evidence to show the bullet went up above here, so now they have the fragment trail going there, even though it doesn't. They want to have the bullets coming down, hitting him in the back, so now the abrasion collar, which is a subtle forensics detail, is at the upper end of the wound, when in fact photographs show that it is not. Dr. Latimer's review, again, don't want to dwell on this other than to show that Latimer himself was abysmally inaccurate in terms of assessing the factual evidence. Here is his skull diagram showing that most of the damage, this is a close duplication, he said, gave very clear and similar duplication to Jack Kennedy's wounds, and you can notice that the front part of the skull is missing and the rest of it's fine, whereas even according to the Rydberg diagram, at least the posterior and the parietal and posterior parietal bones were damaged and missing. And of course, the Boswell face sheet shows that much more was missing than that. Here is Dr. Latimer in the central image here on the bottom. That's his depiction of the skull x-rays, and he shows the right orbit missing. Well, or at least portion of the right orbit. That it's broken away at that point. Well, it's not broken away at that point. This is an image David Mantic prepared on the original skull x-rays when he and I were there together. We worked on this diagram together, and it shows that most of the frontal bone is intact. There is a little bit missing at this point, and this is where the skull is. This is the kind of image Dr. Latimer wrote. He's just not particularly very reliable, unfortunately. Dr. Weck's review I won't discuss in any detail other than to say that a number of experts by then had looked at the autopsy evidence, and no one had come back out to the public to say, hey fellas, Jack Kennedy's brain is missing from the file of evidence, and so are other evidence, including tissue slides. Now, this is very important primary evidence. This stuff just vanished. Let's go on to another secondary source of information. Dr. Levy reports in neurosurgery that Dr. Humes told the House Select Committee on Assassinations that after writing the report, he destroyed the original notes because they were stained with the blood of the president, and he felt it would be inappropriate to retain them in that condition. Now, this is something, again, that I had debunked several times before. Dr. Grossman knew that I debunked this. He complimented me on the essay in which I debunked it. He sat through the lecture that I gave in which I debunked this, as I had debunked all those other things before. And here they are saying that that Humes, putting forward Humes' explanation that he had destroyed original autopsy evidence because it was stained with the president's blood. It's not too hard to see that in a color rendition of the surviving Boswell face sheet, that those splotches there are blood stains. Well, that prompted an interesting exchange when Boswell was being interviewed by the Assassination Records Review Board. Jeremy Gunn asked him, do you see any inconsistency at all between destroying some handwritten notes because they contained blood on them, but preserving other handwritten notes that also had blood on them? And Humes answered, well, only that the others were... Well, only that the others that I destroyed were of my own making. I didn't or wouldn't have had the habit of destroying something someone else had prepared. Well, it turns out that not only had he destroyed his own autopsy autopsy notes, but he also destroyed Dr. Pierre Fink's autopsy notes. And Dr. Fink was complaining about his notes being having vanished after the autopsy. So Humes gave a very inconsistent account of that, unreliable. And perhaps this is one of the most interesting things, and that is that Dr. Levy reported something which has been debunked for a long time. I don't know whether I was the first person to debunk this, but the Assassination Records Review Board is the one that found this information. Dr. Levy reported in neurosurgery that the House Select Committee on Assassinations verified that the post-mortem photographs and x-rays in the custody of the National Archives were authentic. Authentication of the autopsy photographs was essential because of the discrepant descriptions given of the wounds by eyewitnesses at Parkland Memorial Hospital and the doctors present at the autopsy, the Warren Report, and the Clark panel. And Levy, again, let's recap that the HSCA verified that the post-mortem photographs and x-rays in the custody of the National Archives were authentic. But we look at a footnote on the bottom of page 226 in volume 6 of the HSCA, and the footnote in the HSCA reads that because the Department of Defense was unable to locate the camera and lens that were used to take these photographs, the panel was unable to engage in an analysis similar to the one undertaken to essentially close the loop on the Oswald backyard photographs. In other words, the House Select Committee on Assassination said that it essentially authenticated the autopsy photographs, but that the original camera was not available to completely close the loop. Well, again, I had that same quote, the House Select Committee on Assassination saying that the autopsy camera had been lost, and so it couldn't quite close the loop to prove that the autopsy photographs had come from the autopsy camera. It turns out, as the Assassination Records Review Board put it, by late 1997, enough related documents had been located and assembled by the authors to bring into serious doubt the accuracy of the HSCA's conclusion that the Department of Defense was unable to locate the camera and lens used to take the autopsy photographs. It turns out that they had found the camera that took the autopsy photographs, and they tested it against the images, and they didn't match. Now, the irony, this is a huge discrepancy. It's not one I discovered. The Assassination Records Review Board came up with this. But it is one that had been discussed both in the essay that Dr. Levy, or not Dr. Levy probably didn't read it, but Dr. Grossman read, or at least he complimented me on after he said he'd read it. And I'd already debunked this in my talk in Pittsburgh that Dr. Grossman sat through. None of this got apparently understood. But here are the memos right here, and rather than having you try to read them here, I'll quote from them. The Department of Navy sent the HSCA a letter who said, hey, we're not happy with the camera we have here because it doesn't match the photographs. And they wrote back to them saying the camera was the only graphic view camera of this type in use at the National Naval Medical Center in November of 1963. In other words, fellas, you got the camera. It was the only one that was in use here. But as Dr. Blakey put the problem, he said, after examining the camera and comparing its features with the characteristics noted on the autopsy photographs, our photographic experts have determined that this camera, or at least the particular lens and shutter attached to it, could not have been used to take the autopsy pictures. And here is that quote again from volume 6 of the HSCA, the footnote, in which they say that they had been unable to find the camera. Well, the HSCA suppressed the fact that they had been given the camera didn't match the photographs. They reported out that they had not been able to find the camera. And I think it was very misleading. Finally, I just want to dwell on the issue that Levy mentions here, that it was very important to authenticate the autopsy photographs because of the discrepant descriptions given of the wounds by eyewitnesses at Parkland Memorial Hospital and the doctors who were present at the autopsy. In other words, the Parkland doctor said he had a wound in the back of his head here, and of course, you know, the witnesses in the photographs don't show that. Well, that's not true either, as Dr. Grossman should have known, and if Levy had done his homework, he would know that too. This is something the HSCA misled us about. The HSCA wrote, and this is a direct quote from Volume 7, that the critics of the Warren Commission's medical evidence finding believe it is unlikely that trained medical personnel could be so consistently in error, because the autopsy photograph refuted all these Parkland doctors. And in disagreement, second portion, top left, in disagreement with the observations of the Parkland doctors are the 26 people present at the autopsy. All of those interviewed who attended the autopsy corroborated the general location of the wounds as depicted in the photos. None had differing accounts. Is that true? It turns out that they suppressed all these interviews. They interviewed the witnesses at the autopsy. They reported out that the autopsy witnesses endorsed the photographs and that the wounds were toward the front of the head, and yet they suppressed the interviews and you couldn't see them. They would not have been available until 2028 had it not been for the Assassination Records Review Board. Well, the documents come out, and the interviews come out. As well, we were later to discover, did the diagrams that these witnesses at the autopsy reported. Here's here's a fellow named Rudnicki, one of the lab assistants. He described the back right quadrant of JFK's head was missing. Mortician Tom Robinson said JFK's skull wound was directly behind the back of the head. The commanding officer of the Military District of Washington said the skull wound was in the back of the head. And here, bottom right, are the diagrams they prepared showing, as we'll see here again, a fairly consistent pattern. This top left image is one by an FBI agent. The second one to the right of that, another FBI agent, Francis O'Neill and James Siebert, side by side. The top right image is the mortician who prepared the skull for burial. Now, mind you, these guys have prepared these diagrams and given the HSCA testimony saying that the wound was in the back of the head. The HSCA then reports to the public, suppressing these interviews and diagrams, that they'd endorsed the autopsy photographs and refuted the Parkland doctors. The Parkland doctors who said the wound was in the back of the head, and so on and so forth. This is the image of the photograph they were supposed to have endorsed. All of those interviews who attended the autopsy corroborated the general location of the wounds as depicted in the photographs. And you can see yourself, these are the diagrams they suppressed, showing that in fact they did not. They directly refuted them. Here is Francis O'Neill, an FBI agent. Here he is in a television interview in the late 70s, showing where he recalls having seen the wound. Here's a diagram he prepared for the HSCA in which he was one of the people who was supposed to endorse the photograph on the bottom left, which of course he did not. And so here we have assembling, as you saw this before, these are the witnesses who at Parkland Hospital who said the wound involved the right rear of the head. So then I assembled the witnesses who had saw Jack Kennedy's wounds during the autopsy. And whereas the Parkland doctors had the wound overwhelmingly in the right rear of the head, so did the autopsy witnesses. And again, here's Paul O'Connor. Here's a diagram he had, and people looked at this and they said, well, you know, he's just a lab technician. I mean, what does a lab technician know about Jack Kennedy's wounds? And, you know, these guys can be widely inaccurate. He has the skull wound going from fore to aft. Well, you know, that's where Dr. Boswell has it too, and that's where he had it on the night of the autopsy. You know, there's an incredible consistency here, from autopsy pathologists to lab technicians to everyone who saw the wounds during the autopsy, as well as in Parkland. Now, why were the wounds so much larger during the autopsy than they were at Parkland? Well, one can imagine that you're during a resuscitation trying to keep somebody alive, not picking apart their wounds to see the full extent of them after their death, which is what you do during an autopsy. Autopsy findings characteristically will show wounds to be larger than they were noted to be during a rushed or an emergent resuscitation effort. So the fact that they look larger at the autopsy is far from proof that they, in fact, were tampered with in the interim. I mean, they might have been. I don't, in fact, happen to believe they were, but that's not at all surprising. So then let's just, as a final slide, and this will be my second to last slide, these are diagrams that Dr. Grossman prepared for the Assassination Records Review Board along the top, or along the right side. And you can see at the top he has a small, about an inch across, 2.5, 3 centimeter opening on the head wound right there. That's where the bullet went in, he says, and he has an exit there. But look at the trajectory that you have to make those match. I mean, Kennedy's, to have taken a shot from Oswald's position, Kennedy would have had to have been bending down, tying his shoelaces at that point with his head really cranked forward for the bullet to have gone in where he says it went in and where he saw a wound and to come out on the side where he says it came out. You know, I gently nudged him about this, and he says, well, you know, all I can tell you is what I remember. The image in the center right here is the mortician. Is that the mortician? Robinson, I believe so. And then here you have James Siebert, bottom left, Aubrey Bell, one of the nurses. You see the consistency. Here's the autopsy, James Siebert and Aubrey Bell. Well, that's pretty good. There's Parkland, there's Bethesda. And here you have Robinson. He's the mortician. He has it a little bit over to the side, but more toward the center. But again, involving the very rear bottom portion of the head. Jeremy Gunn asked the FBI agent O'Neill, I'd like to ask you whether this photograph resembles what you saw from the back of the head at the time of the autopsy. O'Neill says, this looks like it's been doctored in some way. This is all, you know, these people were supposed to have endorsed the autopsy photographs originally. He asked Mr. Siebert, another FBI agent, does that photograph correspond to your recollection of President Kennedy's skin? I don't remember seeing anything that was like this photo. I don't recall anything like this at all during the autopsy, and it looks like it could have been reconstructed or something. It's a gentle way, I think, of saying doctored. Interestingly enough, this is something that they missed. Yeah, Grossman has this long article about the autopsy evidence, but he doesn't know what he himself told the Assassination Records Review Board. When he was shown the Ida-Dox drawing, Doug Horn reported in the memo, when shown the Ida-Dox drawing, this drawing of the back of the head, autopsy image, Dr. Grossman immediately opined, that's completely incorrect. It shows a small little blood, and by the way, this diagram, let's compare this, just so you can see that. You see how large that looks, that so-called bullet entrance wound, the HSCA? Well, there are internal memos in the House Select Committee on Assassinations where the chairman, Dr. Bodden, writes the artist saying, you can do better than that, Ida. You can make that wound look more like an entrance wound, because what did it really look like? Can you see it there? Almost invisible. I'll show you a color image. There's a color image back up here a bit. Here it is. Where is it? Now, look at that little red splotch there. And in fact, before the HSCA, Dr. Humes looked at this image and said there wasn't any bullet entrance wound there. That red spot looks like a spot of blood to me. Doesn't look like an entrance wound. But you don't see anything that really looks gussy like an entrance wound. Now, when they draw this same diagram, they have the artist do it for the HSCA. What do? This is the HSCA. These people are supposed to be real objective, right? They gussy it up, exaggerate it. It's amazing how they shape the evidence. And you see this going in through all these investigations. You see a consistent pattern of evidence shaping. When shown Dr. Boswell's sketch, this is again something else that wasn't mentioned by neurosurgery. When shown Dr. Boswell's sketch of damage to the superior aspect of President Kennedy's skull drawn at Bethesda autopsy, Dr. Grossman exhibited complete bafflement and said he did not even understand the drawing. And when the ARB staff explained that the notation 10 by 17 missing referred to an area of missing bone in the top of the head, 10 by 17 centimeters in size. In other words, he just says, I don't understand that. In any case, we have a consistent recollection of autopsy photograph, problems with the autopsy photographs. And we also have something else, and that is all the witnesses, or all the primary witnesses testified autopsy photographs they took are missing. Dr. Humes, Dr. Boswell, Dr. Stringer, Floyd Reeby, a photographic assistant. Sorry, I went in the wrong direction. And there's more testimony. Dr. Fink said that he took autopsy photographs that are missing. And here are the autopsy witnesses who said autopsy photographs that they know they took are missing. All three of the pathologists, both the autopsy photographers, FBI Special Agent Francis O'Neill and FBI Agent James Siebert rebuked the autopsy photographs. And even Robert Grossman said, you know, that's completely incorrect. In any case, there's other issues concerning JFK's brain, about how much of it was missing. The brain that turned up during the autopsy weighed 1,500 grams according to the measured brain weight. A normal brain weighs 1,350 grams. So the brain that turns up in autopsy is a brain that looks pretty much like this pen and ink drawing on the right, showing that it's certainly blown out to the side, but little material appears to be missing. Well, what's all this material you see missing in the Zapruder film being blown out of the side that's scattered all over the limousine occupants, all over the cops flying over? There's a lot of brain missing there. And you have all the witnesses, the autopsy saying a lot of his Kennedy's brain was missing, but the one that shows up in the autopsy doesn't seem to have that. Now, those of you that are familiar with the Assassination Records Review Board work say that there's good reason to believe there are two different post-mortem examinations of 2 different JFK brains. Here we are showing that. And what about the autopsy photographs that show this? And the autopsy photographer said that he took autopsy photographs of JFK brain tissues that are missing, and that the images were taken with a camera that he did not use, and yet he is supposedly the autopsy of record. No point in going through the business of eyewitness testimony, but there's reason. And here is the full set of JFK autopsy photographs. And I show them to you only for one reason, and that is, look at the slide left. They took a good image here of the uninjured side of his head, and they have images all around, but they have no good image showing the full extent of his wound from the injured side. They have it from the side here, but they don't have the head tilted aside, pulling the wounds open to show you. Does anyone in this room who is even, even among people who are not doctors, think that you would not have taken at least one photograph showing the full dimensions of the wound? They must have done that. One can be sure that they've done that. And in fact, Dr. Fink testified that they took such photographs, and they're missing. In any case, that's the end of my presentation. I want to thank you very much. And I just want to say that, again, neurosurgery is continuing the pattern of ignoring all new evidence that doesn't conform with a long-term hypothesis, so it would appear.
We probably don't have time for questions right now, but
Yeah,
Rex can do the presentation, and we'll take questions when he's done for both.
Okay, I'm trying to, there we go, okay. Sorry, I'm trying to get this to close out. Rex? Oh, come on. Are you going to use a computer?
No, not going to.
Oh, you're not going to? Okay.
Thanks, Gary.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is going to be Rex Bradford. Just a few quick comments. There are copies here of a William Weston piece called The Two Oswalds, You Are the Jury, available. Brought like about 40 copies, so they're available free here outside on the table. I'll mention again, there's a sign-up list, first come, first served, for a Sunday brunch between noon and 2 this Sunday at the Antares restaurant, which is up at the top of the Needle at the Hyatt Regency. 25% discount for the brunch, and there's a sign-up sheet out on the main table if you're interested in participating in that. So we'll have Rex speak and then take questions for both he and Dr. Aguilar. And Rex Bradford works with the Assassination Archive and Research Center on the board, I think, now, and has done a lot of work of compiling the new documents on CDs and looking through a lot of the new documentary, especially medical evidence. So this is Rex Bradford.
Hello. What I'd like to do today, my talk is called Lessons Learned from 40 Years of Coverup. And what I want to do is talk about sort of general remarks, I guess, on the state of the case as I see it, with some specific emphasis on some of the things that we learned over the last 10 years with the declassifications as a result of the Assassination Records Review Board, because I think it's quite stunning what was learned. Some people may know I'm actually a relative newcomer to the scene, although I think in another decade or two I'm going to have to stop calling myself that. But I learned a great deal that's very troubling over the last several years, and I haven't lost my outrage yet. The first JFK conference that I attended was in 1998, and it was a pretty good-sized affair, and it really galvanized an interest in me that had been growing fast. And it was around that same time that the ARB medical releases came out. And I bought a set, and I was basically shocked by what I read. And then I just sat back and waited for this to show up on the front page of the New York Times. And I stopped waiting after a while, a little sadder but wiser. And so I'm a computer professional by trade, so I took my scanner and computer skills and started making those documents available on a CD-ROM. And that's what got me into what I've been doing since then, which is taking as much as the released record as I can find and making it available on the internet and also on CDs. So I want to start spending a few minutes talking about those medical documents and some of the things that Gary didn't get to because there's so much in there. And then talk about some of the other documentary evidence that came out on other topics in the 1990s. I think we learned a great deal and are still learning a great deal, pretty much everything except who killed John F. Kennedy. And that's because, as we learned time and again, the investigations did their best to avoid answering that question. Sometimes you'll hear people say that eventually the government, will open up and tell the truth on what happened, and I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what's going on and how things work. I don't think the government knows who killed John Kennedy. Nobody on the Warren Commission did. There was a lot of whistling in the dark. It's amazing when you read things. I have yet to see a single person in official capacity even speculate on paper that maybe CE 399, the magic bullet, was planted, even though it seems an obvious possibility, at least, to everyone who looks at the thing. So if the president was murdered by multiple gunmen, then his body would more than likely show evidence of more than one direction of shooting. And so if honorable men for the good of their country, perhaps, needed the solution to that crime to be a lone gunman, then what has to happen? The medical evidence must be suppressed and lied about, and in some cases destroyed and perhaps even altered. And so lo and behold, this is what we find. Now, Gary just covered a great deal of that. We learned in the 1990s that the HSCA wrote a complete falsehood in their report about the corroboration of the location of the head wound by the people they interviewed. And it's quite unusual, actually, for them to actually put a complete falsehood as opposed to figuring out clever ways to mislead people. And it's a sign of desperation in some sense. So as Gary showed, that suppressed witness statements proved that they, in fact, didn't receive that information at all and misrepresented it. The autopsy photographs, as you saw, now are in direct contradiction to virtually all the autopsy witnesses and witnesses at Bethesda, which is a puzzle, although Gary again showed the lack of authentication of the camera that also came out as part of the review board's work. There's also Sandra K. Spencer, who was interviewed by the review board for the first time. She developed autopsy photographs and told the review board that the photos and evidence are not the ones that she developed. Now, I think this one is a little more complex. I actually believe that this is a second set of photographs that was possibly taken by Chief Knudsen even after the reconstruction of the body for reasons which are unclear, although it certainly shows that pictures can be made to disappear. And as Gary also covered, the brain photos, which are used to support the official theory of the shooting, also have problems. They're circumstantial evidence of an amazing event, if it occurred, which is that two brains were subjected to two separate brain exams by personnel which included Dr. Humes and Dr. Boswell on both occasions, which would be quite an amazing thing. And John Stringer, the person who is alleged to have taken the photographs that are in the archives, disavowed them in 4 very specific ways before the review board. We learned a little bit more from the review board releases about Dr. Berkeley, who was the president's personal physician, the only doctor present at both Parkland and Bethesda, who could have shed light on the discrepancies between the reporting that was supposedly emanating from those two places. He's the person who signed the president's death certificate, which was itself suppressed, presumably because it showed that the back wound entered at the 3rd thoracic vertebrae, which is out of single bullet range. Berkeley is the man the Warren Commission apparently never heard of, because you'll search the 26 volumes for him in vain. What we learned from the House Select Committee files when they became public was that Berkeley had his lawyer contact the committee in its early days, in March of 1977, with the news that he acknowledged that, quote, others besides Oswald must have participated. Luckily for the ongoing cover-up, House Select Committee Chief Counsel Sprague was ousted within days of receiving this letter, and was replaced by Robert Blakey, and then things were back to normal. Berkeley was never called to testify before the House Medical Panel, that most uncurious of bodies. And for those who haven't heard, there's an interesting oral history of Berkeley in the JFK Library, and also reproduced by the review board, from October of '67, in which the questioner asks, do you agree with the Warren report on the number of bullets that entered President Kennedy's body? And Berkeley's reply is, I would not care to be quoted on that. to which the questioner's follow-up reply is, "I see." So what I've talked about doesn't begin to scratch the surface. Gary covered a great deal. The medical evidence is extensive and deep and contradictory. So if we learned so much about it, I guess, then did we finally learn how many shots were fired and from what direction? And I think the answer, unfortunately, is no. The medical evidence is an unholy mess. I could come up with a theory of what really happened in the shooting, but I don't think I could probably get 5 out of 10 people in this room to say, yes, that's absolutely true. This is the legacy of so much cover-up and misinformation, and I believe also in some instances evidence alteration and perjury. The truth is buried under lies. To illustrate this point, I want to challenge the notion, which is shared by both lone nutters and by many conspiracy-oriented medical experts, that the Kennedy autopsy was bungled, that it was what Harold Weisberg termed unworthy even of a Bowery bum. Now, I certainly couldn't agree more that the reporting that came out of the autopsy is grossly inadequate, but I think what happened at the autopsy remains more mysterious than it's sometimes given credit for. Take, for instance, the idea that the autopsy doctors didn't know until Saturday morning that there was a wound in the anterior neck when they called Dallas belatedly and got that news. And that's when the light bulbs went on and they supposedly said, oh, that's where the bullet that came in the back or the back of the neck or wherever it was went out the throat. The story about the Saturday calls to Dallas is received wisdom at this point, and it's repeated on both sides of the debate. And I just don't think it's true. Back in 1964, Dr. Perry told the Warren Commission that Dr. Humes called me twice on Friday afternoon. And our inspector told him, well, didn't he mean Saturday? And Dr. Perry accommodated him, but later in did slip again. I seem to remember it being Friday for some reason. Well, it turns out that John Ebersol, the acting chief of radiology at the autopsy, told the HSA medical panel in a suppressed interview that by 10 or 10:30 at night, a communication had been established with Dallas. Nurse Audrey Bell of Parkland Hospital was interviewed by the review board in 1997, and she said that on Saturday morning after the assassination, she saw Dr. Perry, and he looked like pure hell because he didn't get enough sleep between the calls to Bethesda that came in during the night. What were these calls about? Dr. Perry had explained to Nurse Bell, oh, whether there was an entrance wound or an exit wound in the throat, they were wanting me to change my mind. So, if this is true, why did the Friday night calls have to disappear and be changed to Saturday? Well, for one thing, otherwise there would be no excuse for not having dissected the back and neck wounds and traced the bullet path. What Pierre Fink admitted under cross-examination in the Clay Shaw trial, that he was ordered not to dissect the neck, would not have played well at a Warren Commission hearing. So there are reasons to believe, I think, that the autopsy was perhaps not as shoddy as it appears today, but that they may actually have been deceptive in real time. And along with this, it may have been a little more complete than we now think, but the completeness has been buried for reasons of state. Case in point here, I think, is the testimony and other indications that perhaps pictures were taken with probes in the body, probes which showed the paths of wounds. White House photographer Robert Knudsen, who was involved in the processing of autopsy photographs, was greatly disturbed in his previously suppressed House Select Committee testimony that no pictures of such probes were in the archives. He had a very distinct memory of at least one, and he thought multiple such pictures. Also, autopsy witness Dr. Carney told the review board that he thought multiple, he recalled a photograph being taken with a probe in the president's body. And there's an interesting internal CBS memorandum published by the review board in which Dr. Humes himself, the chief autopsy pathologist, told a CBS employee who went to the same church as he did that a photograph was taken of the body with a probe in it illustrating a bullet path. Now, interestingly, Humes said that these pictures were taken with FBI agents and others out of the room. So this leads to the possibility that the autopsy was at once somewhat more thorough than we now give it credit for, but that it was also purposefully conducted in such a way to keep most of the observers in the dark. I can speculate that perhaps the autopsy team, or at least Humes and Boswell, got a version of the big national security cover-up story that we now know that Earl Warren got to sign him on to the Warren Commission. Maybe they were told that they should do their job, but they didn't want the other observers to come away certain that this was a big multi-shooter communist conspiracy that would kick us into a war that would kill 40 million Americans, et cetera, et cetera. This is speculation, of course, but I guess that's my point. that the goal of clarifying the medical evidence undertaken by the review board has only served to underscore what a deep hole it is. I think Richard Russell saw it all the way back in 1964 when at a brief medical discussion in a Warren Commission executive session, he said, "This isn't going to be something that would run you stark mad." Okay, so I want to move on from medical evidence and talk about a couple of other areas where we learned a great deal in the 1990s. I think we learned quite a bit more about the web of intelligence that surrounded Oswald. Over the years, one by one of his friends and acquaintances have turned out to be either intelligence agents or friends of agents or witting assets of some form. Oswald's friend George de Mohrenschildt admitted before his death that his friend, the local CIA officer, had him keeping tabs on Oswald. On a related note, a little off topic, but I think it's an interesting story. About 6 months before de Mohrenschildt's death, we find out now from CIA files, he wrote a letter to then CIA Director George Herbert Walker Bush, almost literally pleading for his life. Bush noted in a memo to his subordinates that, yes, I know this man. Bush had roomed at Andover with de Mohrenschildt's nephew and had first met de Mohrenschildt himself in the 1940s. And then Bush personally drafted a letter back to de Mohrenschildt saying essentially, have a nice life, or not as it turned out. So we have 2 degrees of separation between Oswald and the current president's father. We also learned from the files a while back in the 70s that another friend, Ruth Payne, who couldn't remember before the Warren Commission which agency of government her sister worked for, that department turned out to be, drum roll please, the Central Intelligence Agency. Easy thing to forget. And in the New Orleans grand jury transcripts, which were targeted to be burned by the DA who replaced Jim Garrison, but were saved in a garage and made it to the review board in the mid-90s, Marina Oswald Porter, in secret grand jury testimony, was asked why she cut off contact with Ruth Payne. Ruth Payne, for people that don't know, was housing Marina at the time of the assassination. Her answer? Quote, I was advised by Secret Service not to be connected with her. Seems like she was not connected, she was sympathizing with the CIA. She wrote letters over there and they told me for my own reputation to stay away. Speaking of the Garrison investigation, we learned more about the CIA's monitoring and intense fear of that effort. There was a 1967 meeting of high-level officials in counterintelligence, and Ray Rocca, who was head of research and analysis of that division, predicted that Garrison would in fact obtain a conviction. Declassification of the 90s also showed that Priscilla Johnson, one of the 2 journalists who interviewed Oswald during his alleged defection to the Soviet Union, and later author of the book Marina and Lee, had applied to work for the CIA in the 50s and was considered by some in the agency to be a witting asset of theirs. Also in the 1990s, a photograph surfaced which finally proved that David Ferrie and Lee Oswald were together in the Civil Air Patrol, and so on and so on. We also learned, courtesy of Jeff Morley more recently, that the CIA officer brought out of retirement to serve as liaison to the House Committee turns out to have been the man who was in charge of running the DRE, the Cuban exile group, which included Carlos Springrear, who had the scuffle with Oswald and debated him in New Orleans. Robert Blakey has since said that if he knew at the time who Joanides, this man, was, he would have had him on the witness stand and not serving document requests. In summary, there are no documents which prove that Lee Harvey Oswald was himself an agent of U.S. intelligence. Not that you would probably find them if there were. But if you look at his friends, he was either an agent of some form or he was certainly surrounded and watched by those who were. In another area that's of great interest to me, Mexico City, we learned a whole lot, although I'm afraid that this is another one of those areas where the more you stare, the more you go blind. We learned first that Earl Warren was reluctantly brought upon board the President's Commission, and we learned this from Johnson taped phone calls, which you can listen to. Johnson told him something that Hoover told me about Mexico City, and whatever that something was caused Warren to begin crying. And that first week, Johnson was banding about with other people the figure of 40 million Americans dead in a nuclear exchange with the Soviets. And we now know that this story that the assassination would lead to Castro and possibly to Khrushchev had a great deal of quote evidence behind it. some of which is available now and some of which you only get whispers of to this day. The evidence is ultimately false, certainly in my view. But it was nonetheless used in order to put the people onto the cover-up who normally might not have participated. We learned that, for instance, despite denials by the CIA and FBI that a tape recording of someone phoning the Soviet embassy in Mexico City and calling himself Lee Oswald was listened to by FBI agents in Dallas while Oswald was still alive, and those agents reported that the voice on the tapes did not match the living Lee Harvey Oswald. We learned that FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover informed the new President Johnson of all this on the morning after the assassination, and that the tape of this phone call has itself been erased. We learned that the CIA translators, as well as David Phillips, remembered a third call, a lengthy call, with Oswald speaking in English and asking the Soviets for money. This is a tape call which appears nowhere in the transcript record we have now. Such a call, if it existed, has disappeared from the record, but perhaps it would have been what scared the federal government into a national security cover-up, not the more innocuous visa-related calls which are now on the record. John Newman and Peter Dale Scott have both written about the cables of October. When Mexico City sent a cable on Oswald's visit in early October of '63, headquarters sent back a cable to Mexico City, which included false information about Oswald. For example, noting that the last information they had was from 1962, when in fact they'd received FBI reports from quite recently. At the same time, the very same officers sent a cable to other agencies of the government, including the FBI and state, passing along an incorrect description of Oswald. And when CIA officer Jane Roman, one of the people involved in putting together both these cables, was confronted in 1995 in an interview by Jeff Morley and John Newman, she admitted that, "I'm signing off on something I know isn't true," and said that this indicated information held very tightly on a need-to-know basis. And this is prior to the assassination, of course. We learned that the CIA, besides its telephone tapping and photo surveillance operations, had at least 2 human informants in the Cuban embassy, that they bugged it with microphones, picked its trash, followed embassy-related people around in vans, monitored all flights to and from Havana, and obtained the passenger list from those flights, and on and on. If anybody plotted to murder President Kennedy inside the Cuban embassy, the CIA would have been the first to know. Now, the House Select Committee did a much better job pursuing Mexico City than it did the medical evidence, in my opinion. There are certainly a few pretty searing letters from the head of the committee to CIA head Stansfield Turner, although in the end, the committee buried most of what it learned. It also chased the Castro did it boogeyman that the CIA trotted out for it, just as it had the Church Committee earlier. Now, I could go on with tidbits of things we've learned, but the problem is that it's really hard to fit them together into a coherent whole. When CIA employees interviewed by the House Select Committee weren't busy being able not to remember anything, what they said usually conflicted with the written record. Even Ann Goodpasture, who in the early '70s wrote the CIA's 133-page chronology of Mexico City events, presumably for the purpose of keeping its falsehoods straight, she started out her 1995 review board testimony by saying that she might say things that conflicted with the written record because of faulty memory. When Ray Rocca, who was the head of research and analysis and counterintelligence, was shown the cable traffic by the House Select Committee in his interview, he had a great deal of trouble answering questions and finally threw up his hands and asked, "Where are the earlier cables?" Win Scott, the famed Mexico City CIA chief of station, wrote in his memoirs the following, which was quoted by Chairman Louis Stokes of the House Select Committee in a strongly worded letter to Stansfield Turner. And Scott wrote, quote, "Persons watching these embassies photographed Oswald as he entered and left each one and clocked the time he spent on each visit." As many people know, the agency has never adequately explained why it could never produce a photo of Oswald, nor has it offered a believable story about the tapes. So, from all that's now available, can we piece together the story? I think the attempt is important because it's my belief that what happened in Mexico City, if known, has great explanatory power for the rest of the assassination story. But this is precisely why it's been subjected to the same level of obfuscation as the medical evidence. Smarter people than I have studied Mexico City in detail, and so far I think we still have more questions than answers. Peter Dale Scott's Deep Politics 2, I think, asks most of the good questions, and the new releases since that book have added a lot more questions, but precious little in the way of hard answers. The central issues as I see them are, one, was Lee Harvey Oswald impersonated in Mexico City, either telephonically or in person or both? And related to this, who was the mystery man in the photos that were sent up? Another question is, was the record of activities recorded more sinister than the visa shopping on the part of Oswald that we see in the record? And by this, I don't mean the Alvarado story of Oswald taking $6,500 to kill Kennedy in the embassy, because to me that seems like it's reasonably well debunked and an improvisation after the fact. There are more subtle mysteries about the question of whether Oswald or someone pretending to be him threatened the life of Kennedy in the Cuban embassy. And certainly there's the question of whether there's a missing tape transcript more sinister than the ones we have transcripts of now in the record. And lastly, I think an important question is whether the Oswald activities, whatever they were part of a legitimate intelligence operation, part of an assassination frame-up plan, or both. The only answer I feel I can confidently make to those questions is that Oswald was impersonated telephonically at least. Beyond that, the questions beget more questions, and just as in the medical evidence, you find that the witness accounts vary widely from what's in the written record. I'm going to skip a little bit for reasons of time. Foreign policy, interestingly enough, is an area where we learn some amazing things from declassifications of supposed JFK assassination records. We learned that the prime organizers of the Bay of Pigs invasion thought that the date had been blown and told their superiors, but nobody apparently told Kennedy, and the event went ahead as planned. We also got confirmation of spring 1963 Vietnam withdrawal plans in the form of a May Secretary of Defense conference on Vietnam, which included a printed timetable for withdrawal and an admonition from McNamara that this was not fast enough. The biggest surprise probably was the Operation Northwoods papers, the Joint Chiefs plan to simulate or create actual terrorist attacks on the U.S., which could be blamed on Castro and which could then be responded to by an invasion of Cuba. An interesting story I think is relevant comes from Red Fay, who was a friend of Kennedy's, appointed to be Undersecretary of the Navy, who wrote a book called The Pleasure of His Company. Fay describes being on a yacht with Kennedy after John Kennedy had read 7 Days in May. And JFK described the conditions under which the U.S. military might overthrow an American president. He said it would have to be a young president. Kennedy was elected at age 43. And he would have to have a Bay of Pigs type failure. This would make the military nervous and engage in a little criticizing behind his back. And then if there was a second Bay of Pigs, they might get really antsy and stand ready to do their patriotic duty to protect the nation. And then if there was a third such event, they would act. Kennedy concluded this unusual musing in front of his stunned audience by saying, "But it won't happen on my watch." Well, if you look at the history, Kennedy had the Bay of Pigs, of course. Later, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis with the Joint Chiefs, not to mention Dean Acheson, Richard Russell, and other people thumping on the table to invade Cuba. For the third failure, take your pick. The opening of a second track channel of negotiations with Castro, which was done behind the back of the rest of the government, but certainly not unknown to them, or the Vietnam withdrawal plans we now see that were on the books in the spring of '63. I think the possibility of 13 more years of Kennedy's in the White House would not have been attractive to some very powerful people. So speaking of who killed John Kennedy, if anybody was hoping that the archives would open and finally they would have to tell us what happened, I'm sorry to report that you need to move to another country or another planet or something. There may be a Star Chamber vault somewhere that keeps the real history. My feeling is it's almost worse than that there isn't anybody around to tell you what happened. The government, by that, if you mean the people on the TV and all who we see running the show, doesn't know who killed John Kennedy, and some of them would probably be very curious to find out. I've noticed that in some recent conferences there's a distinct trend away from talking about who killed President Kennedy, and there's good reasons for that. It can be irresponsible to speculate too wildly. The debate also, though, I think tends to be mired in forensics. And I don't want to poo-poo this, and I certainly don't take the attitude that, oh, the evidence is all fake, so don't paying attention to it. But I still think that with all we've learned about the bigger picture, that it's strange that 40 years later, that it's possible even that we can have a debate about exactly where the fatal bullet that entered John Kennedy's skull. And I think the fact that there is a debate that goes on is instructive in its own right. Gary mentioned the neurosurgery article, and it's been fascinating for me to watch in the last couple of years what I call the lone nut community. And it's more than this article. They are all reverting back to the low entrance wound in the skull, and essentially trying to erase the House Select Committee and just go back to 1964 and the Warren Commission report and hope that people haven't learned things over the years. The neurosurgery article even quotes the House Medical Panel at length when it feels like it wants to buttress up their case. But, you know, the House Medical Panel, of course, would be rolling in its grave to hear the head wound being moved 4 inches back down after they worked so hard to move it up. I'm not a doctor and I don't play one at conferences, but I will say that the most revealing aspect of the entire matter is that the location of the bullet that entered John Kennedy's skull and killed him is not known with absolute certainty down to the centimeter. I don't believe that the record on the medical evidence or in Mexico City or any of the other tangled matters is a mess because of sloppiness on the part of the autopsy doctors or FBI agents or Warren Commission staffers. And it's not assassination buffs who are moving this wound 4 inches around. I think the record is a mess, and it's a mess for a good reason, because if it wasn't a mess, we would know who killed John Kennedy. I think the answer to that question is not provable by the record itself, which can only serve to prove that the government worked assiduously and intensely to avoid finding out. But I think it can rule out certain suspects. I don't believe, for instance, that it's any longer credible to say that Carlos Marcello got a stone in his shoe and he thought to himself, hey, there's this CIA false defector named Oswald back from the Soviet Union in my city, so why don't I send him to Mexico City to be caught speaking on tapped telephone lines, and maybe then I can set him up to take the fall for killing Kennedy. Oh, and I must remember to figure out a way to get the FBI to take Oswald off the watch list before he goes down there. And besides the mob, Fidel Castro is, of course, the favorite fallback. If you read the 3-volume station history of the Mexico City station compiled by Ann Goodpasture, or at least the parts that aren't blacked out, it would be hard to say that Cuban agents could have planned what to have for breakfast without the CIA knowing about it. One of the transcripts of tapped phone calls provided to the Warren Commission was between Cuban President Dorticos and the Cuba's ambassador to Mexico, Armas, in the aftermath of the assassination. And one of the most striking things about this call is how much trouble these two men have themselves just understanding each other on this phone line. I think perhaps maybe it has too many taps on it. I don't know, but if they had plotted a murder over that phone line, they might have whacked the president of Venezuela by mistake. How Castro's people impersonated Secret Service agents behind the grassy knoll has never been adequately explained to me either. It's my belief that at this juncture, the range of credible explanations for the assassination have narrowed considerably, thanks to the tenacious and intelligent work of the citizen researchers, including many people in this room. I guess in my view, to speculate briefly, the low-end range of such plots has people who had a pretty high level in intelligence. People certainly have bandied about over the years the names of folks like David Phillips and David Morales and CIA asset and mob chieftain Johnny Roselli and people like that, with probably Texas help as well on the ground. And on the other end, you can take it all the way up to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the people inside and outside the government that work with them. The murder itself was a class operation on the ground, and it was run by people in the government who knew a great deal about intelligence and with enough clout to have their fingers on the system in the lead up to the assassination, in my view. But to untangle this with any specificity and certainty, well, I don't want to stop anybody, but I think it's instructive to look at the Church Committee's efforts to figure out exactly what was going on with the plots to kill Fidel Castro. I think it's a credit to their tenacity that they got as far as they did, but they still ended up with fundamental uncertainty about even whether presidents knew and even whether CIA directors themselves were or were not informed at various stages. They ran into a system of plausible deniability, compartmentalization, need to know, insulated layers, and not to mention the phrase, I don't recall, when all else fails. William Harvey, who was in charge of these plots, left behind a memo which referred to backstopping the record with forged and backdated 201 files, something we may want to keep in mind as we inspect the records of one Lee Harvey Oswald. So I guess I'd also say that at this stage, 40 years later, I'm not sure that who killed JFK is even the most important question anymore. I think certainly it matters a great deal that in 1963 the democratic process was subverted by gunplay. But I think what happened afterwards was probably worse. The society's finest, men of unimpeachable reputation, put the most impressive face on utter nonsense. And the media and the rest of responsible society lined up behind them and has been done so ever since, and the damage done is untold. The most positive aspect of all this, I think, has been the ordinary people who never bought the story, despite the most intense and sustained public relations campaign in modern history. Pundits will often lament the modern loss of faith in government, which is, of course, traceable to the time of the Kennedy assassination and the Vietnam War, which happened to follow it. I think the unfortunate truth here is that the loss of faith in government is a sign of mental health. Another positive aspect of all the digging that the Kennedy assassination inspired in so many people, I think, is that it's helped to open up a whole world, unfortunately the real world, for a lot of people. Think of the names that are household words to us in this room, for instance: Richard Helms, William Harvey, James Angleton, Johnny Roselli, Allen Dulles. And I'm always amazed at how the names keep coming up, how recent the event is in some ways. Porter Goss, who's now the CIA head involved in conducting a purge of those in the agency who are not considered loyal enough to the White House, was in fact a covert operator in Miami in the 1960s and also served for a time in Mexico City. Maybe he has a photo of Oswald. But the society's failure to come to grips with the assassination is troublesome, and it would be so nice to get it corrected. However, if you open up a history textbook or an encyclopedia to this day, right now in 2004, you will find the same nonsense from 40 years ago. I looked recently at Microsoft Encarta, which is the most popular electronic encyclopedia in the world, used by millions upon millions of students. And it's improving, I guess. A few years ago, it used to say 2 shots were fired and the president fell forward. In the new edition, they're now up to 3 shots, but he's still falling the wrong way. I think the problem is that to confront the assassination honestly is to confront American society honestly with all its problems, and that's not easy. Last month, I don't know how many people caught the documentary on the Robert Kennedy, the life of Robert Kennedy. And I think it was okay. It was pretty much what you'd expect. It covered the transformation of Robert Kennedy from McCarthy aide to the president's right-hand man and to his grief in the aftermath of his brother's murder. But, you know, there's this point they reach in the documentary where his brother John Kennedy is killed tragically, and it's presented like it might as well have been a freak elevator accident. And then at the end of the documentary, Robert himself runs for president, and boom, another elevator accident. The real story of Robert Kennedy, I think, is the most poignant Greek tragedy in American politics, and it can't be told on American TV. The real story is of a man who grew up in his brother's shadow, and Bobby is the bulldog side of cool brother Jack, pushing the fight against organized crime and running the covert action in Cuba and so on. And one day, boom, all that's gone. And Robert Kennedy is no idiot. He knows that his brother's political enemies have killed him. And they haven't gone away. They're out there, unseen but very real. Bobby stays in politics. It's what he knows, but he's bored in the Senate. So he goes to South Africa, and he hangs with Cesar Chavez and turns against the Vietnam War. And along the way, something interesting happens to them. He finds his own vision, and I think, frankly, it's a better and more compassionate vision than his brother's. But the Greek tragedy follows that. In 1968, the path to the presidency opens up for him, and after a lot of agonizing, he picks up that mantle and starts walking up a hill that I think he has to know has the strongest likelihood of his own death at the end of it. There are guns waiting at the top of the hill, but he takes the road anyway. There's a book, 85 Days, by Jules Witcover, which tells the story of the campaign. And when RFK was on the campaign trail in April of 1968, 1 week after the murder of Martin Luther King, and the word comes into campaign aide Fred Dutton that a rifleman's been seen on a roof. So Dutton enters Kennedy's hotel room and just goes over and quietly closes the window curtains. And Bobby Kennedy just turns to him and says, "Don't close them. If they're going to shoot, they'll shoot." Now, there are a lot of stories that Robert Kennedy intended to reopen the investigation into his brother's murder upon achieving the presidency, despite his studious avoidance of comment on the matter. And if this is true, to me it shows the folly of the idea of denying the truth now in order to achieve power and tell the truth later. I'd like to finish in a few minutes by talking about what the goal is for us here in 2004. One goal for many people here, obviously, is to learn as much as we can about the truth of the Kennedy assassination. Now, I've in this talk expressed some pessimism about reaching a full understanding of that event that most of the people in this room could agree on, let alone the people outside who may simply refuse to believe what they don't want to believe. But I'm more than happy to be proved wrong, and there's amazing work still going on. I know that John Hunt, for instance, has been finding some incredible stuff related to medical and ballistics evidence in the National Archives. I think that I hope there are budding authors that are studying the HSCA files, because we've had a lot of postmortem books on the Warren Commission and only one on the HSCA, and I think there's incredible stories to tell there. The CIA segregated collection has volumes of information on Cuban exiles and other aspects of the larger story, which deserve to be told. And people know things like Jeff Morley's dragging out the story of CIA obstruction of the House Committee. Don Thomas, if you're familiar with his work over the last few years and the acoustics evidence, it shows that even the basic core evidence hasn't been fully utilized. So I hardly want to be here discouraging people who have done the heavy lifting to move this case forward year after year. For myself personally, the goal has started to change to be less about figuring out who killed John Kennedy and more about communicating what we've already learned about the societal dysfunction and truth-telling which surrounds the whole affair. In this respect, the JFK case is hardly unique, of course, but I think it has great value because so much digging has been done and so much is known. The record on this case is a window onto a world that we seldom get such good glimpses of. I think the longer-term verdict of history is actually still up for grabs. Perhaps a major breakthrough may occur, or books being now written may eventually win the day. It's also possible it may simply have to wait until the assassination is old and safe, like the Lincoln assassination is today, and when every major figure alive at the time is dead, and the Cold War is some antiquity. And when it's finally safe to do so, perhaps the historical profession will be the first mainstream institution to pick up the voluminous threads that have been laid down, both by the hard work of getting the government's record declassified and by the expert analysis provided by people in this room and outside it. And more immediately, I think there's always new students and citizens who can learn a great deal both about the Kennedy assassination and about larger issues of their lives and the politics of the government and of the world, frankly, as well as the ancient 1960s. And so that's where I put my energies. My particular passion, as some people know, is to use my skills to make as much of the documentary record available as possible via the internet and on CD-ROMs. I think there's a lot of useful things other people can do if they have an interest here along these lines. For instance, I never realized until getting into the case how many oral histories are conducted of important people. And an oral history project interviewing all the experts on this case, I think, would be amazingly valuable, both to continue the sharing of information and to lay down for posterity as well. The Kennedy assassination may be 40 years old and thus seemingly irrelevant to many people, but I think every important political event where lies become the accepted wisdom needs to be challenged. And this assassination is really unique because we've broken through the crap and exposed a great deal of the naked emperor in incredible detail for anyone who cares to look. And so for that reason alone, I think the story is too important to let slip down the memory hole.